700 elite Persian Immortals faced 15,000 Babylonian defenders behind walls that had never been breached in 1,000 years. Their commander, Gobryas, was 62 years old, ancient by military standards, carrying wounds from 30 campaigns, and burning with personal hatred so consuming it made tactical decisions dangerous. By dawn, the greatest city in the ancient world would fall without a single stone of its legendary walls being damaged, and the blood of Babylon's king would stain the palace floor. Here's what I'm going to reveal. First, the military engineering impossibility that allowed 700 men to enter an impregnable fortress defended by 15 times their number. Second, the psychological warfare tactic so brilliant it turned Babylon's own citizens into saboteurs of their king's defense. Third, the personal revenge that transformed this from a conquest into something far more savage. How could walls 80 feet high and 30 feet thick, so wide that chariot races were held on top, be bypassed completely? Why did Babylonian soldiers throw down their weapons when they saw Persian forces materializing inside gates that should have been sealed? What made the notoriously disciplined Immortals break formation to hunt one specific man through palace corridors? How did a river become the key to breaching walls that had humiliated every empire that ever tried? This is the story of Gobryas and how 700 warriors conquered the unconquerable city through a feat of engineering audacity that defied every siege principle known to the ancient world. To understand how the Persians entered Babylon without breaking its walls, we need to step back to the moment when Cyrus the Great decided that simply capturing Babylon wasn't enough. He needed to humiliate it. To understand how 700 Immortals achieved the impossible at Babylon, let me take you to 539 BCE, when the greatest city mankind had ever built stood at the center of a rapidly crumbling empire. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was the city. For over a millennium, it had been civilization's crown jewel. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, cascaded from its terraces. The Ishtar Gate gleamed with glazed blue bricks depicting golden dragons and bulls. The Ziggurat Tower reached toward the heavens like humanity's middle finger to the gods. But by 539 BCE, cracks were showing in paradise. King Nabonidus had spent a decade absent from the capital, obsessing over moon god worship in Arabian deserts, while Babylon's infrastructure decayed and its merchant class seethed with resentment. His son Belshazzar ruled as regent, throwing legendary feasts while tax revenue plummeted and the army went months without pay. The Babylonian Empire was rotting from within, and everyone knew it, especially the predators circling outside. Enter Gobryas, governor of Gutium and commander of some of Babylon's finest eastern troops. At 62, this wasn't just another general, this was a man forged in the brutal mountain warfare of the Zagros range, scarred from 3 decades of fighting and carrying a grudge so personal it eclipsed all political loyalty. 15 years earlier, Nabonidus had executed Gobryas's only son on trumped-up treason charges during one of the king's paranoid purges. They called him the Grey Wolf, not for his age, but for his patience in stalking prey. While other officers ranted about injustice, Gobryas simply smiled, bided his time, and waited for the perfect moment to make Nabonidus pay in blood. He was professional in public, deadly in private. And when Cyrus, the Great of Persia, began his westward expansion, Gobryas saw opportunity written in the stars. His personal stake went beyond military glory. This was about watching the man who murdered his son die, choking on his own terror. Across from him stood King Belshazzar, 38 years old and desperately trying to fill his absent father's throne. Belshazzar had inherited the crown prince position, not because he was exceptional, but because he was the only option. He'd overseen several successful trade expeditions in his youth, which made him think he understood warfare. He didn't, but he commanded genuine respect from Babylon's merchant elite, and his religious pragmatism, actually showing up to festivals unlike his father, had brought him crucial support. When Persian armies began swallowing Mesopotamian cities like a flood, Belshazzar made the strategically sound decision to withdraw all forces behind Babylon's impregnable walls. His advisors told him those walls had broken every siege in history. The Assyrians tried for 3 years and failed. The Elamites died by thousands against them. The Hittites never even attempted it. Belshazzar believed reasonably that no army could breach them. He stocked the city with provisions for a 20-year siege, called in every garrison from the empire's collapsing borders, and settled in to wait out the Persians. The power dynamic was absurd on paper. Cyrus commanded perhaps 60,000 troops in the region, but couldn't commit them all to one siege. Babylon's walls protected 15,000 professional soldiers, plus another 30,000 militia who could man the ramparts. The city could sustain itself indefinitely. The Euphrates River flowed directly through it, providing unlimited water, and the granaries bulged with grain. Economically, Babylon remained the ancient world's banking center. Its gold reserves dwarfed Persia's entire treasury. It wasn't a question of if the Persian siege would collapse, but when Cyrus would have to withdraw with his tail between his legs. Every military calculus favored Babylon. The walls were mathematically undefeatable, but Gobryas had something no one else possessed: intimate knowledge of Babylon's hidden vulnerability. As a former governor who'd spent years in the capital, he knew its infrastructure like he knew the scars on his own body. More importantly, he knew that Cyrus wanted Babylon intact, its wealth, its prestige, its political legitimacy as the ancient world's eternal capital. A 3-year siege that starved the city into submission, that left rubble and resentment. What Cyrus needed was a surgical strike that would decapitate Babylonian leadership while leaving the city functional, and Gobryas knew exactly how to deliver it. The catalyst came when scouts reported Belshazzar's feast. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. This wasn't just any party. It was the annual Akitu festival, Babylon's most sacred celebration, and Belshazzar was throwing it despite his father still being alive and technically king. This was politically explosive, a statement that Nabonidus was finished, that Belshazzar was the real power now. Every noble in the city had to attend or face being marked as disloyal, which meant that on one specific night, Babylon's entire command structure would be drunk and distracted in the royal palace. As Persian forces surrounded Babylon's walls and began digging what looked like siege trenches, the stage was set for the most audacious infiltration in ancient military history. The Persian army that ringed Babylon's walls looked insignificant compared to the city's defenses, but its reputation alone made stone walls seem fragile. Cyrus had assembled approximately 30,000 troops for the Babylon campaign, modest by empire-crushing standards, but these weren't ordinary soldiers. If they'd marched in formation, the column would have stretched for 8 miles. But their true strength wasn't in numbers. The corps consisted of 10,000 immortals, history's most elite fighting force, so named because their ranks were always instantly refilled. If one fell, another stepped forward, so that the unit always numbered exactly 10,000. Each immortal wore bronze-scaled armor that caught sunlight like dragon skin, carried a 7-foot spear with a silver pomegranate counterweight, and had trained since age 7 in archery, swordsmanship, and formation discipline that bordered on supernatural. Supporting the Immortals were 15,000 Persian and Median infantry conscripts and professional soldiers who formed the siege workforce, and 5,000 cavalry units that could ride for 3 days without rest, living off dried meat and mare's milk. Their weapons technology was cutting edge. Composite bows that could pierce armor at 200 yards. Bronze swords, forged with techniques that wouldn't be matched for centuries, and siege equipment that engineers were currently assembling from timber harvested from the Zagros Mountains. But Cyrus's greatest asset wasn't military hardware, it was psychological warfare mastery. His reputation for clemency toward conquered cities had already caused 3 Babylonian garrison towns to surrender without a fight, their governors calculating that Persian rule might actually be better than serving the erratic Nabonidus. The Persian supply chain was equally impressive. Thousands of support personnel maintained grain depots, managed livestock herds that fed the army, and operated a courier system that could transmit orders from Cyrus to forward commanders within hours using relay riders. At the heart of this vast military machine stood Gobryas and his hand-picked 700. These weren't random immortals, these were Eastern frontier veterans, men who'd fought in mountain ambushes and desert raids, where stealth mattered more than formation discipline. Gobryas himself could barely mount a horse without assistance anymore. Decades of combat had left him with a limp from a Scythian arrow that never properly healed, and his right hand bore burn scars from a siege fire in Gutium. Attendants helped him into his armor each dawn, and he required herbal medicine to manage pain that would have crippled lesser men. But his mind remained razor-sharp, and his hatred for Nabonidus burned hotter than any physical agony. His key lieutenants included Darius, who would later become king himself, a brilliant tactician, just 28 years old, with an unsettling ability to predict enemy movements, and Intaphanes, a grizzled siege engineer who'd helped capture fortified cities from India to Anatolia. What made this 700-man strike force special, despite their pathetic numbers compared to Babylon's defenders, was singular purpose and perfect knowledge. Every man had been briefed on Babylon's street layout. They'd practiced formation movements in mock-ups of Babylonian palace corridors. They understood that this wasn't a battle, it was an assassination mission wearing military clothing. Their greatest internal challenge wasn't morale or supplies. It was restraining Gobryas's bloodlust. Darius reportedly had to remind his commander 3 times that capturing Nabonidus alive was the strategic goal, not butchering him like a sacrificial goat. The old general's personal vendetta threatened to compromise tactical precision. Babylon itself sat at the nexus of ancient Mesopotamia, where the Euphrates River created a natural highway through the desert. Strategically, whoever controlled Babylon controlled trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to India. Cyrus couldn't simply bypass it and continue westward, leaving Babylon unconquered, meant leaving a dagger pointed at Persia's back. The city's location also offered significant defensive advantages. Approach from any direction, and you'd be visible for miles across flat plains, giving defenders ample warning. The Euphrates, flowing directly through the city, meant unlimited water historically. Besieging forces ran out of supplies before Babylon did. The walls themselves were the stuff of legend. Ancient historians claimed they stretched 56 miles in circumference, though modern archaeology suggests closer to 11 miles, still staggeringly large. They rose 80 feet high and measured 30 feet thick at the base, constructed from millions of mud bricks baked harder than stone by Mesopotamian sun. Herodotus wrote that 4-horse chariots could race side by side atop them, and archaeological evidence confirms this wasn't exaggeration. The walls featured 250 watchtowers spaced at regular intervals, each manned by archers with clear sightlines across the plains. 8 massive gates controlled entry, each one a fortress unto itself with multiple defensive layers. The famous Ishtar Gate alone contained 575 tons of material and was decorated with 120 sculpted lions and dragons, psychological warfare, suggesting that gods themselves defended this city. But psychological warfare cuts both ways. As Persian forces settled into siege positions, Gobryas ordered a campaign of systematic cruelty calculated to provoke rash action from Babylon's defenders. Persian cavalry raiders burned 60 villages within 3 days, driving thousands of refugees toward Babylon's gates, creating a humanitarian crisis that strained the city's supplies despite its famous granaries. Smoke pillars rose from burning grain fields, visible from the city's highest towers, a message that if Babylon wanted a siege, the Persians would turn the surrounding countryside into a desert. Economic damage mounted exponentially. Trade caravans refused to approach, cutting off Babylon's tax revenue. Merchant families who'd grown wealthy on the Silk Road watched their warehouses burn and their profits evaporate into ash clouds. What Gobryas did next defied every conventional siege rule. Instead of building battering rams or siege towers to assault those impregnable walls, he ordered his engineers to start digging. Not tunnels toward the walls that would take years, but trenches running parallel to the Euphrates, north and south of the city. To observers on Babylon's walls, this looked pointless, even comical. Were the Persians planning to dig their way to victory? Babylonian soldiers mocked the effort, convinced these foreigners didn't understand basic siege warfare. But Belshazzar's more thoughtful advisors felt unease. They couldn't articulate. Why would Gobryas, who knew Babylon, intimately waste labor on meaningless earthworks? What did he see that they were missing? But the old wolf had made a critical miscalculation. Or perhaps, watching from behind those legendary walls, Belshazzar had. The siege of Babylon became a masterclass in patience and misdirection. But the opening moves happened so subtly that most of Babylon's defenders didn't recognize the threat until the trap had already closed. Day one brought what looked like standard siege procedure. Persian engineers completed their mysterious canal digging north and south of the city, while the main force established fortified camps beyond arrow range of the walls. Babylonian archers took potshots at workers, killing perhaps a dozen Persian laborers, but the digging continued with mechanical efficiency. Inside Babylon, confidence ran high. Belshazzar's advisors calculated that at the current pace, the Persians would need 3 years to achieve anything meaningful. Food supplies remained abundant. The Euphrates provided unlimited water. Morale stayed solid. Day 3 changed the calculus. Persian cavalry began systematic raids on surrounding villages that had somehow survived the initial scorched earth campaign. But these weren't random attacks, they targeted Babylon's intelligence network. Village elders who'd been feeding information to the city about Persian movements suddenly fell silent, their bodies left in town squares with tongues cut out as warning. Babylon went blind. Scouts who ventured beyond the walls rarely returned, and those who did reported unsettling news. The Persian canals weren't normal siege trenches. They were too deep, too precisely engineered, and they seemed to be diverting river water into artificial basins being excavated in the desert. What the hell was Gobryas planning? Day 7 brought the first real fear. That morning, Babylonian sentries on the northern wall noticed the Euphrates running slightly lower than normal. By evening, it had dropped 6 inches. By midnight, another foot. The river hadn't merely slowed, it was being systematically drained. Panic rippled through the command structure. An emergency council convened in the palace where Belshazzar demanded explanations. How much lower could it go? Could the Persians actually drain a river that had flowed since the dawn of civilization? The king's engineers assured him the feat was impossible. The Euphrates' volume was too massive, the flow rate too powerful. They were seeing seasonal variation, nothing more. But in the palace shadows, older advisors who'd served under previous kings remembered ancient engineering plans, forgotten construction details about why the walls stopped at the riverbanks instead of extending across the water. Throughout this mounting crisis, the 700 immortals assigned to Gobryas's strike force endured their own psychological crucible. They camped separately from the main Persian army, drilling endlessly in formations that made no sense for traditional combat. They practiced moving in absolute silence, each man memorizing the position of the man ahead and behind so they could navigate in pitch darkness. Gobryas drilled them on Babylon's street layout using sand maps, quizzing individuals randomly. You're at the Ishtar Gate. You need to reach the royal palace. What route? Any man who hesitated was pulled from the mission and replaced. The physical preparation was brutal, but the restraint required was worse. These were elite warriors being told they wouldn't fight a battle, they'd infiltrate like thieves, strike like assassins, and disappear before conventional combat began. The urge to charge those walls, to prove their courage in open combat, burned in every warrior's heart, but discipline held. Day 12 marked the breaking point. The Euphrates had dropped to half its normal depth. The waterline that had lapped against Babylon's riverside walls for 1,000 years now sat 15 feet lower, exposing ancient stonework that generations of Babylonians had never seen. More critically, the river gates' massive, bronze-reinforced barriers that sealed where the Euphrates entered and exited the city, under the walls, suddenly became vulnerable. These gates had always been submerged, protected by water depth and current that made approaching them suicide. But now they sat in water shallow enough for men to wade through if they were willing to risk it. This was the moment of Gobryas' genius revealing itself. He hadn't planned to break Babylon's legendary walls. He'd planned to walk under them through passages the Babylonians themselves had built but forgotten were vulnerabilities. Ancient Babylon had constructed river gates to control flooding and manage water levels during seasonal variations. But centuries of stable climate had made those precautions seem permanent. The gates were chained shut and hadn't been inspected in decades. Why would they be? The river was always deep. Except now it wasn't. On day 14, Persian engineers began the final phase. Using the artificial basins they'd excavated, they diverted the Euphrates almost entirely away from Babylon, sending it through new channels that ran into desert sinks miles away. The river inside the city became a trickling creek. Babylonian defenders on the walls watched in horror as the water dropped low enough to expose the river gates fully. Emergency crews rushed to reinforce them, piling stones and debris to block the passages. But they had mere hours to seal openings that were 20 feet high and designed to resist water pressure from the wrong direction. Meanwhile, inside the city, Belshazzar made his catastrophic decision. With Persian attention focused on these river gates and the siege dragging into its third week, he decided to proceed with the Akitu festival as planned. Cancelling it would signal fear and damage morale worse than any Persian raid. Besides, the walls had held perfectly, not a single Persian soldier had breached them through conventional assault. The king's advisors supported the decision. Show confidence. Demonstrate that Babylon's power remained unshaken. Throw the greatest feast in the city's history, while barbarians scratched uselessly at impenetrable fortifications. The feast itself became legendary. The biblical book of Daniel would later immortalize it as the Writing on the Wall banquet. On the night of day 15, every noble, every military commander above the rank of captain, every influential merchant attended the royal palace. They drank from sacred vessels Nebuchadnezzar had looted from Jerusalem's temple, served wine in gold cups that weighed 2 pounds each, and consumed enough food to feed a small city. Music drowned out any noise from outside. The celebration lasted into the night, growing more raucous with each hour. Guards on the walls remained vigilant, but command structure dissolved into drunken revelry. This is where knowing Gobryas' psychology changes everything. A purely tactical commander would have exploited the feast to capture Babylon with minimal bloodshed. But the Grey Wolf didn't want minimal bloodshed. He wanted Belshazzar to die terrified, to watch his world collapse before death claimed him. So when Persian scouts confirmed that the feast was reaching its drunken peak around midnight, Gobryas gave the order his 700 had been waiting for. Into the river, silent advance. Kill anyone who sounds an alarm. Find me the king. The trap he'd spent 15 days preparing was about to snap shut. But Belshazzar, dancing drunkenly in his palace, while his commanders laughed and his guests gorged themselves, didn't know it yet. At precisely 1 a.m., 3 sharp whistles cut through the Persian camp outside Babylon's northern wall. Gobryas raises his scarred hand, and 700 immortals move like a single shadow toward the Euphrates riverbed. The descent into the nearly dry river channel is surreal. Men who'd trained their entire lives for open combat now wade through knee-deep water, armor muffled with cloth wrappings to prevent the telltale clink of bronze. The exposed riverbed stinks of ancient mud and rotting vegetation. Fish flop desperately in shrinking pools, their thrashing the only sound besides 700 pairs of sandaled feet finding purchase on slick stone. Above them, Babylon's walls rise like cliffs, and for the first time in history, those legendary fortifications become irrelevant. The immortals aren't attacking them, they're bypassing them entirely through infrastructure Babylon's own engineers created centuries ago. The psychological shift ripples through both armies simultaneously. On Babylon's walls, the few sober sentries who notice movement in the riverbed below initially think they're hallucinating. Then horror strikes. They're screaming warnings. But the palace is half a mile away, and drunken revelry drowns out their shouts. Inside the city, servants hauling wine to the feast hear strange sounds from the river gates, but assume it's rats or debris. What they're actually hearing is 700 elite warriors cutting through ancient chains with Persian steel that slices bronze like butter. Present tense begins now. The river gates groan open. The sound reverberates through stone passages like a dying giant. 700 warriors pour through the opening in disciplined columns, each man knowing exactly where to go because they've rehearsed this infiltration 100 times. The impact of their coordinated movement shakes the ancient stonework. Drops of water fall from arched ceilings that haven't seen human traffic in living memory. Bronze armor catches torchlight from distant palace windows, creating brief flashes that look like demon eyes in darkness. The physics of what happens next explains why superior numbers won't save Babylon. The Immortals aren't spreading out to fight, they're driving like a spear point toward one objective, the royal palace. 700 disciplined soldiers moving in formation through narrow city streets create an unstoppable momentum. Any guard they encounter doesn't face a fair fight, they face a wall of advancing shields. Spears thrust in synchronized strikes, and warriors who kill without breaking stride. The first Babylonian patrol, 6 drowsy soldiers doing routine rounds, simply ceases to exist. Spears punch through their bodies before they can draw weapons. The Immortals step over corpses without slowing. This isn't battle anymore. It's a guided missile of human flesh and bronze crashing through an unprepared city. While confused guards scramble to understand what's happening, Gobryas has positioned his force with devastating precision. 200 Immortals peel off to secure the Ishtar Gate from the inside, preventing any organized military response from reaching the palace. Another 100 move to secure the inner palace gates, trapping the feast attendees inside. The remaining 400, including Gobryas himself, old and scarred and moving with adrenaline-fueled speed that defies his age, drive straight toward the throne room where they can hear music and laughter spilling into the night. At 1:47 a.m., the impossible begins. The bronze doors of the great feast hall crash open. Persian warriors flood into a room where Babylon's entire leadership sits drunk and defenseless. The music dies mid-note. Wine cups freeze halfway to lips. For one eternal heartbeat, nobody moves. Then Gobryas roars his son's name, a sound so full of grief and fury that it transcends language, and 400 Immortals surge forward. The slaughter in the feast hall isn't a battle, it's an execution. Babylonian nobles scramble for weapons that aren't there, impeded by ceremonial robes, blinded by wine, dying with food still in their mouths. Within 90 seconds, 200 of Babylon's elite lie dead or dying on marble floors, slick with blood and spilled wine. The casualty ratio is so lopsided it barely qualifies as violence. This is simple butchery of unprepared victims. Belshazzar, to his credit, doesn't freeze. He grabs a ceremonial sword from the wall and actually manages to parry the first strike aimed at him. For perhaps 10 seconds, the king of Babylon fights like his life depends on it, because it does. But he's drunk, exhausted from hours of feasting, wearing ceremonial clothing instead of armor, facing stone-sober killers who've trained for exactly this moment. A spear thrust from his left side punches through his ribs. He staggers. A second strike opens his throat. The king of Babylon dies, choking on his own blood, collapsing at the foot of his throne, while Persian warriors wash over his bodyguards like a tsunami over sand castles. But Gobryas isn't satisfied with Belshazzar's death. He's screaming for Nabonidus, demanding to know where the real king hides. Turns out the paranoid old monarch isn't even in Babylon. He's fled to Borsippa, a secondary city, weeks ago. The intelligence failure hits Gobryas like a physical blow. His son's murderer won't die here tonight. The rage that sustained him through 15 days of patience, through years of planning, through the careful construction of this perfect trap, it all channels into savage violence against anyone within reach. His own officers have to physically restrain him from massacring fleeing servants who had nothing to do with his son's execution. Meanwhile, throughout the city, panic begins its deadly work. The 15,000 Babylonian soldiers manning the walls hear screaming from the palace district. They hear the combat. They understand that somehow impossibly enemy forces are inside the city, but they don't know how many. They don't know where the breach occurred. They don't have orders because their commanders are dying in a palace feast hall. Some units abandon their posts to rush toward the palace. Others hold position, awaiting orders that will never come. Still others, calculating that Babylon has already fallen and resistance is pointless, simply throw down their weapons and flee into the night. At 2:15 a.m., the Immortals who secured the Ishtar Gate from inside open it fully. The main Persian army, thousands of troops who've been waiting for this signal, floods into Babylon through gates that have protected the city for centuries. What every military manual said was impossible is unfolding before 50,000 eyes. The greatest city in the world has fallen in less than 90 minutes. Not through siege warfare, but through brilliant exploitation of a vulnerability no one remembered existed. By 3 a.m., organized Babylonian resistance has completely collapsed. Persian soldiers control every major gate, every strategic intersection, every palace entrance. The legendary walls of Babylon stand intact and unbreached. They just don't matter anymore. Defenders who remained at their posts now find themselves surrounded, cut off from command, unsure if continuing to fight makes them brave or suicidal. Most choose surrender.